Brothers and sisters, there comes a time when silence is betrayal, and that time is long past. We were warned not with whispers, but with fire, not with comfort, but with clarity. The truth was spoken, but the ears of the nation were closed. The mind of the system was locked, and the heart was cold. They tell you the battle is over, that rights were won, that the dream was achieved. But look around you. The nightmare still walks in daylight. They say you're free, yet you live in fear. They say you're equal, yet you're still begging for justice. They say you have a voice, yet the moment you raise it, they try to silence it. We were warned that integration without power is submission. We were warned that peace without justice is a funeral dressed in white. We were warned that the same hand that pats you on the back can stab you when you turn around. And still, no one listened. They wanted the truth until they heard it. They wanted change until they had to change. They wanted progress as long as it didn't cost them power. This is not about hate. This is about truth. This is not about revenge. This is about awakening. This is not about skin. This is about systems. Truth was spoken, but the system refused to hear it. The truth was not whispered. It was not hidden in coded language or delivered through timid speech. It came bold, raw, unapologetic. It rang from pulpits, echoed through community halls, spilled into the streets. It was shouted in the face of oppression, declared under the shadow of violence, and spoken even when the cost was death. The truth did not wait for permission. It did not seek approval. It stood tall in a world that demanded it kneel, and yet the system, blind by design and deaf by intention, turned its face and closed its ears. The truth said the playing field was never level. It said the scales of justice had always been tilted. It said freedom handed down from the oppressor was never true freedom. It said peace imposed by force was not peace at all. The truth spoke of exploitation not as a relic of the past, but as the engine of the present. It exposed not just individual hatred, but institutional design. The laws, the schools, the banks, the police, the press, all woven together into a web that traps those who try to rise and punishes those who dare to question why they were ever held down. But the system didn't want to hear that, because to hear would be to admit complicity. To listen would require action, real action. Not symbolic gestures, not shallow apologies, not incremental reforms that change language but not structure. Real action means redistribution of power. It means restructuring how wealth, access, and opportunity are controlled. That is a truth the system is built to reject. So instead, the system did what it always does. It distorted the truth. It softened it. It diluted it until it became palatable, markable, toothless. It took revolution and turned it into diversity workshops. It took resistance and turned it into hashtags. It took voices raised in anguish and cut them into sound bites. It took cries of liberation and turned them into slogans for corporate branding. And while the message was being massaged, the conditions remained. The neighborhood still crumbled. The schools still failed. The prisons still filled. The truth was still being spoken, but fewer and fewer could hear it through the static. There were moments when it nearly broke through. Moments when the truth grew too loud to ignore. When bodies lay in the streets and the cameras rolled. When the outrage could not be contained. When the fires lit not just buildings, but the nation's conscience. For a moment, the system paused. It blinked. It offered promises. It nodded and whispered the language of reform. But soon enough, the distractions returned. The political games resumed. The headlines shifted. And the truth once again was pushed back into the margins. Those who spoke the truth were not treated as prophets. They were treated as threats, watched, targeted, labeled as radicals, agitators, extremists, not because they lied, but because they dared to tell the truth without apology, because they refused to make it comfortable, because they exposed the rot beneath the surface. And when they refused to back down, the system made examples of them, fired them, silenced them, exiled them, sometimes even killed them, not always with bullets, sometimes with poverty, with isolation, with character assassination, all tools in the same box. But the truth does not die when the speaker is gone. It lingers, it waits, it repeats itself through new voices, new bodies, new movements. Yet each time it returns, the system pretends it's hearing it for the first time. It acts shock. It holds town halls. It launches panels. It commissions reports. And yet the foundations remain untouched. The same cycles continue. The truth is never unknown. It is simply unwelcome. It's not that the system cannot hear. It's that it refuses to listen. Because listening would mean facing its own reflection. And that reflection is ugly. It is not the image the nation paints of itself. It is not the story taught in classrooms or celebrated on holidays. That reflection shows a country not of liberty and justice, but of control and dominance. It shows a machine that eats the poor to feed the rich, that builds its monuments atop broken backs, that criminalizes poverty and monetizes pain. That reflection is hard to look at, so instead the system smashes the mirror. There have always been people who try to warn us, who try to pull the curtain back. They don't ask for applause. They don't seek fame. They speak because they must. Because to stay silent would be betrayal. Because they see what others pretend not to. And when they speak, the truth comes alive. It vibrates through every word. It makes the air heavy. It wakes the sleeping. And for a moment, the system trembles. But it is practiced in survival. It knows how to spin, how to stall, how to suppress. And so it recovers, it retaliates. It labels the warning as exaggeration, the speaker as unstable, the message as dangerous. But the real danger is the silence that follows, the apathy, the forgetting, the rewriting. The truth doesn't just disappear, it is buried beneath distractions, beneath propaganda, beneath comfortable lies. And we walk around believing we were never warned, that no one ever said it, that this all came out of nowhere. But we were warned. The truth was spoken. Again and again. It echoed in sermons and speeches. It lived in poetry and protest. It rose from the mouths of children, of mothers, of elders, of prisoners, of prophets. It was etched in blood and carved into history. The truth was never hiding. It was standing in front of us the entire time. But the system refused to hear it. Integration without power is submission. They told us that the doors were finally open, that we could now sit at the same counters, ride the same buses, walk through the same front doors. They told us that the dream was realized, that equality had been achieved because the signs came down, the water fountains were shared, and the schools were desegregated. They called it victory, they called it progress. But progress without power is performance. Integration, when stripped of justice and control, becomes a pacifier, not a path to liberation. Being allowed in the room does not mean you've been handed the keys. They welcomed you into their spaces, not to share ownership, but to quiet your demands. They said, come in, but they didn't say, take charge. They said, join us, but they didn't say, let us. They offered proximity to power, but never power itself. And when you integrate without controlling your resources, your communities, your representation, your narratives, then all you've done is blend into someone else's system while remaining powerless within it. They gave you seats in institutions you didn't build, in systems that were not designed for your benefit. You became part of structures still laced with supremacy. The boardroom didn't change its values because you walked in. The courtroom didn't dispense new justice because your skin was darker. The police didn't protect differently because you sat on the city council. Power isn't shared by appearance, it is taken by control. And when you lack control, integration becomes illusion. They called it inclusion, but it was absorption. They took your best minds, your brightest leaders, your most eloquent voices, and gave them titles, while the masses stayed trapped in the same cycle. They offered you visibility in exchange for silence. They offered you access in exchange for obedience. The price of admission was often your anger, your resistance, your history. You could be part of their world if you agreed not to challenge how it worked. And in doing so, they tamed a movement that once threatened to transform the nation. The community was told to aspire to proximity, not to power. Young people were told to succeed within the system, not to question its legitimacy. The narrative shifted from freedom to respectability, from protest to professionalism, from demands to decorum. And as that shift happened, the collective power of the people was drained. The energy that once built independent schools, created self-sufficient businesses, defended neighborhoods, educated the grassroots. That energy was redirected into climbing ladders that never reached the top. Integration became about individuals winning, not about communities rising. One black lawyer, one brown senator, one first of her kind, one historic appointment, one billionaire face in a sea of poverty, and each time they pointed and said, look, progress. But if the neighborhood is still crumbling, if the police still brutalize, if the hospital still denies care, if the school still fails your children, what does one success mean? A trophy is not transformation. A title is not freedom. You were taught that acceptance was the goal, that inclusion into their systems was enough. But if you're included in a broken system, then your inclusion becomes part of the problem. If you are invited to the table only to be served last, or served up as a token, then what have you really gained? If your presence does not alter the conditions for your people, then your presence becomes decoration, and decoration is not liberation. Real integration cannot exist without real power. And power does not ask for permission. It organizes, it demands, it builds. It withdraws participation when exploited. It creates its own institutions when denied entry. It funds its own schools, publishes its own press, patrols its own streets, sets its own agenda. Power is not gifted by the oppressor. It is taken by the oppressed. And unless integration includes the ability to control the terms of your participation, then you're not equal. You're dependent. The system will always offer just enough to calm the unrest. It will give a little to keep you from asking for more. It will parade the successful few to hide the suffering of the many. And it will call this balance. But the scales are still tipped, because those who control the economy, the media, the politics, they didn't give up their power when they integrated. They just gave you a seat in the corner while they still ran the show. They taught us that the struggle was about access, when the real fight has always been about ownership. ownership of land, ownership of education, ownership of labor, ownership of destiny. You can't liberate a people by simply sitting them next to those who rule over them. Liberation comes when that rule is challenged, restructured, replaced. Anything less is cosmetic. Anything less is submission disguised as success. You were never meant to simply join their system. You were meant to transform it, to question its foundations, to demand a new architecture that did not rely on your silence, your sacrifice, or your suffering. But they feared that transformation, so they gave you integration without power, visibility without voice, presence without protection. And they told you to be grateful. You cannot integrate into a house that was built to exclude you and expect shelter. You cannot live by the rules of a game designed for your failure and expect victory. True justice does not come from fitting into the framework of your oppressor. It comes from shattering that framework and building in you. Without that power, without that control, integration becomes a mirage. You see yourself in it, but when you reach for it, nothing changes. The hands are still shackled, and the system still smiles, pretending it has freed you. They fear your unity more than your anger. Anger is loud, it burns hot, erupts fast, and draws attention. They can handle your anger. They expect it. In fact, they prepare for it. They build riot squads, craft headlines, draft laws, deploy distractions. They'll let you shout in the streets as long as you go home divided. They'll let you burn buildings as long as you don't build movements. Anger, by itself, is noise. It rattles the system, but it does not remove it. It stirs the public, but it does not shift the balance of power. What truly terrifies those in control is not your rage. It's your organization. It's your clarity. It's your discipline. Because when you are angry and isolated, they can label you. They can pathologize you. They can arrest one, silence another, co-opt a third. They can turn your fury into spectacle, a headline, a soundbite, a viral clip. But when you unite, when your anger becomes coordinated, strategic, collective, it becomes unstoppable. When your voice joins others, when your pain links with others, when your purpose is shared across neighborhoods, cities, classes, and faiths, then your struggle transforms into a threat they cannot contain. They do not fear the mob, they fear the mission. They fear the moment when you stop reacting and start organizing. They fear when you stop shouting at each other and start listening to one another. They fear when you realize that the divisions they fed you, the lines they drew between skin tone, between language, between class, between gender, were designed to keep you from discovering your true powers. Unity, they fear when you step out of the cage of individualism and recognize the force of the collective. History has shown this over and over. Every time people began to move as one, every time the oppressed began to see past the distractions and the manufactured enemies, the system cracked. Whether it was workers uniting across race, students marching across campuses, tenants refusing to leave their homes, or nations rising up against colonizers, unity has always been the lever that moves empires. That's why it's the one thing the system fights hardest to prevent. They invest billions to keep you distracted. Entertainment, news, algorithms, culture wars, all crafted to keep you busy, divided, suspicious of your neighbor. They want you fighting each other over crumbs while they feast on the whole table. They want you focused on identity as a weapon, not identity as a source of pride and solidarity. They'll let you argue over symbols as long as you don't question structures. They'll feed you controversy after controversy to keep you from ever asking who benefits when we are divided. They will tolerate your protests, even your violence, as long as they can keep you fragmented. They know that scattered energy burns out quickly. That anger without direction exhausts itself. But unity sustains, unity plans, unity protects. When people unite, they protect their leaders, they guard their communities, they educate their youth, they support their elders, and they feed each other. Unity builds its own networks, creates its own economies, and writes its own narratives. That's not just resistance, that's revolution. They understand that one person with a gun is not as dangerous as 1,000 people with a purpose. One loud protest is not as dangerous as 100 quiet meetings. One viral tweet is not as dangerous as a grassroots coalition that stretches across states. Anger, when untamed, is a storm. It comes, it roars, and it fades. But unity is a tide, steady, constant, patient, rising inch by inch until it reshapes the entire shore. So they fear the church when it joins hands with the mosque. They fear the immigrant worker marching beside the union leader. They fear the black youth reading history with the poor white farmer. They fear the indigenous elder teaching sovereignty to the city activist. Because every time you find common ground, you shake their foundation. Every time you build trust across barriers, you weaken their control. Every time you replace suspicion with solidarity, they lose another tool in their arsenal. They have always feared this. It's why infiltrators were planted, why leaders were watched, why movements were splintered from the inside. Because unity makes you unpredictable. It makes you ungovernable. It makes you powerful. The moment you stop fighting each other and start fighting for each other, the game changes. You stop being a problem to be policed and become a force to be negotiated with. You don't have to agree on everything to be united. Unity is not uniformity. It's not about erasing difference. It's about aligning purpose. It's about seeing that your liberation is tied to your neighbors, even if they don't look like you, or pray like you, or speak like you. It's about recognizing that the same boot is on all your necks, and only together can you throw it off. They will always try to distract you with fear, fear of each other, fear of outsiders, fear of failure. They will tell you unity is dangerous. They will call it radical, subversive, unrealistic, not because it won't work, but because it will. Because once you are united, you cannot be ignored. Once you are united, you cannot be bought. Once you are united, you cannot be broken. That is why they fear your unity more than your anger. Don't quote the warning, be the answer. It is easy to repeat the words of those who came before us, to lift their speeches, their slogans, their fire, and post it in fragments, to treat their voices like relics, their passion like poetry, their urgency like art. The problem is not that we remember their words. The problem is we stop at remembering. We quote them to feel inspired, to seem aware, to sound bold. But they didn't speak so we could recite. They spoke so we could act. They didn't risk their lives for their names to be turned into hashtags. They gave their lives so we could finish what they started. Warnings were given, not for decoration, not for ceremony, but for preparation. They weren't just telling us what was wrong. They were telling us what was coming. They didn't speak out to be admired. They spoke out to awaken. And yet, time and time again, we've turned their courage into comfort. We've turned their resistance into rituals. We play clips. We hang portraits. We quote lines in moments of tragedy, and then go back to silence the next day. The warning wasn't a prophecy to admire. It was a call to arms. It was a map drawn in blood, showing us the traps, the turns, the systems designed to hold us down. And still, the same injustices live on. The same violence continues. The same lies are told. The same tools of oppression remain polished and ready. And we still quote the warning instead of confronting the problem. The system doesn't fear your quotes. It fears your action. It fears when you move with purpose, when you carry the weight of the message forward, when you use your body, your time, your energy to dismantle what the warning was meant to stop. They expect you to mourn. They expect you to post. They do not expect you to organize. They do not expect you to fight. They do not expect you to win. So much energy is spent memorizing speeches, analyzing texts, sharing stories of the past. But if those stories do not push you to build something new, they become distractions. You are not preserving a legacy by repeating it. You are preserving it by advancing it, by making the message a movement, by becoming the living answer to the question every warning posed: who will rise when I fall? When they said the enemy would disguise itself in law and order, it wasn't to impress you with foresight. It was to prepare you for manipulation. When they said your leaders would be targeted, it wasn't to make them martyrs. It was to warn you that the struggle would be lonely. When they said peace without justice is betrayal, it wasn't meant to sound poetic. It was meant to keep you from accepting crumbs while your people still starve. You quote the words, but are you living them? Are you challenging the status quo? Are you building what was torn down? Are you protecting those who continue to speak, who continue to resist? Are you holding up the people on the front lines? Or are you just watching? Are you sacrificing anything, comfort, convenience, popularity, to be part of the solution? The warnings have been clear. The truth has been spoken. Not once, not by one, but over and over in every generation. And still the cages remain. The poverty remains. The violence remains. So the question is not, what would they say today? The question is, what are you doing today? If you see what they saw, hear what they heard, feel what they felt, then why do you not act as they acted? Don't praise their courage if you cower in the face of the same enemies. Don't honor their legacy if you ignore the same cries they couldn't ignore. Don't recite their speeches if you won't step into their shoes. The world doesn't need another tribute. It needs transformation. It doesn't need another mural. It needs a movement. It doesn't need more memory. It needs momentum. Quoting the warning may show that you remember, but becoming the answer shows that you understand. It means recognizing that every word was meant for you. Every caution, every cry, every line of truth. It was handed to you not as history, but as instruction. Not to admire, but to apply. Not to make you feel good, but to make you move forward. There is no shortage of words. There is no shortage of knowledge. We know what's wrong. We've known for decades. We've studied it, filmed it, written about it, published books and podcasts and documentaries. But knowledge without action is just indulgence. Awareness without responsibility is just performance. The warnings have always pointed to power. Who has it? Who doesn't? How it's used, how it's stolen, how it's preserved. So if you quote the warning, ask yourself, what power am I challenging today? What system am I dismantling? What voices am I amplifying? What sacrifice am I making so that others can rise? You weren't called to remember. You were called to respond. You weren't called to retweet. You were called to resist. You weren't called to admire the fire. You were called to carry the torch. Every word spoken in truth was left in your hands like a tool, not to decorate your page, but to build a new foundation, not to be repeated, but to be realized. There are already too many statues and not enough strategies, too many documentaries and not enough disruption, too many eulogies and not enough evolution. The truth has never been missing. The warning has never been unclear. What has been missing is the will to become what the truth demands, the courage to stand where others fell, the discipline to organize when it's no longer trending, the strength to fight not just in protest but in persistence. Quoting the warning gives the appearance of wisdom. Living the answer is the only proof.